Okay, and welcome everyone to this online seminar. And I would like especially to welcome our expert today, Frederik Smets. And we're very happy to have Frederik from the UNHCR with us today. So Frederik Smets is an Associate Education and Advocacy Officer at the Regional Representation of EU Affairs of UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. He's primarily responsible for development of teaching materials and training on the topics of refugees, asylum, and migration in Europe. Frederik has been with the UNHCR for over 6 years. He studied communication sciences and later dropped out of teaching training to become a journalist in his native Belgium. Before joining UNHCR, he also worked in European Parliament as a consultant and as a public servant. So we're very, very happy to have Frederik with us with such rich experience and diverse experience. And we're very happy to have all of you on board. So just before I pass the microphone to Frederik, I would like to remind some rules of netiquette. And as you know, the chat, we keep it only for questions and comments regarding the topic. And as you know, I'm sure there will be many questions and many comments, as this is really a relevant and hot topic today and in general. So please keep the chat clean from hellos, how are you, hi from whatever country you are, because otherwise it will be difficult for me as a moderator to spot your questions. So from this moment onwards, I would really ask you to respect this request and only post relevant questions and comments in the chat. Okay, now in case you have any difficulties to hear me, please make sure that your speakers are connected and you have the maximum volume on, because we tested this environment and we're connected also with a cable, so everything should work. Okay, so in case you have any problem, just make sure that your speakers are connected and defined also on Adobe. And without further hesitation, I pass the microphone to Frederik, and of course also the stage. We cannot hear you. Let me just unmute you. Just a second. There you go.
Okay. Alex, can you hear me? I think the sound is all right now. Shall I start?
Yes, clear.
Yes. Okay, great.
Please.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And thank you for that kind introduction, Alexandra. And it's a real pleasure to be here today on this eTwinning seminar. So all of you from, I could already see in the chat that you are from far and wide across the continent and beyond. So welcome all in this eTwinning seminar, and it's a real pleasure to be here. First of all, I'll tell you a little bit about the organization that I'm working for. So as Alexandra said in the introduction, I work for UNHCR. Most of you may know UNHCR from this image, which I'm showing you here, which is a refugee camp in South America. And you can see our logo on those tents, UNHCR. So we are the United Nations agency that is primarily responsible in the world for helping refugees. So refugees are people that are fleeing war and or persecution. And unfortunately, a lot of these people that are escaping war or persecution leave everything they have behind, including the places they live, of course, and then in some emergency cases, they end up in a refugee camp like this one, and they have to stay in shelters like this, sometimes for many months, and in some cases even for years. But UNHCR is basically the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And I'll give you a little bit of a potted history on this organization. The person you can see here, the gentleman with the gray hair, is Filippo Grandi. He's Italian and he is the current High Commissioner for Refugees. So he is the chief of our agency. On the left there, you can see our logo. And if you look at our logo, you can see that there is a person in the middle and that there are two hands around this person protecting the person. Now that expresses actually what we mainly do at UNHCR. So our primary purpose at UNHCR is to safeguard the rights and well-being of people who have been forced to flee. So what does that mean, forced to flee? And we'll come back to that later. Forced to flee means that because of violence or because of persecution, you are forced to leave the place where you live, and to get to safety, you have to go to another place. That's basically the kind of people that we try to help. Now, what do we do? First of all, we worldwide we try to ensure that everybody has the right to seek asylum and to find safe refuge in another country. So what does that mean? Some of you may have heard of the Geneva Convention on the Rights of Refugees. Well, after the Second World War, the United Nations and most of the United Nations member countries signed a convention in which they said that after the horrors of the Second World War, we would never send anybody that is a danger back to the country where they came from. So the basic principle of the Geneva Convention and of the protection of refugees in the world is based on that principle that we would never send people back to danger. So that's the easiest way I can explain it. Our organization was founded in the 1950s, the early 1950s, so we've recently celebrated our 70th birthday. And since that start in the 1950s, UNHCR has actually provided assistance to millions and millions of people that had to flee their country to become refugees. We don't only help refugees, we also help returnees, stateless people, internally displaced, and asylum seekers, which are different categories. I will come back to that later, so don't worry about this terminology. We know that this is a complex matter, but I will come back to this later, and I will explain all these categories to you, and so you can use them in your educational context. So coming back to the question of what we exactly do, we provide protection, so we make sure that if people are forced to flee their country, they can find a safe place in another country. We protect shelter. You've seen the photo of the tents that I've just showed you. So we provide shelter when needed. We provide health services and education services to people that are forced to flee. And we also work a lot with governments that provide these services for refugees. So that's basically what we do. A few facts and figures. We are a rather large agency. We are one of the largest agencies of the United Nations. So as of May 2019, I had well over 16,800 colleagues. 90% of those are based in the field. But what does that mean? Based in the field means that most of the people that work for UNHCR are working close to the refugees in the countries where we can find them. So for example, in the Middle East, you will find colleagues in Jordan, you will find colleagues in Syria, you will find colleagues in Iraq, you will find colleagues in Turkey, and you will find colleagues in Lebanon, among others. In the case of Africa, you will find a lot of people in Uganda, in countries like Tanzania, South Sudan, Central African Republic, and other countries. But we are basically all over the world because we work in 134 countries. So this brings me a little bit to why is school important for refugees? So you know now a little bit about people forced to flee their country because of war and persecution. They have to leave everything behind and they go to another country. A lot of these people that have to flee to another country are children. About 50% of those fleeing to another country are actually children. But why is school so important for refugee children specifically? Well, school is actually a safe place. School is actually a safe place where refugee children are protected from some of the dangers they may face when they are out of school. You can imagine these dangers. These could be any range from exploitation, irregular labor, crime, and sometimes even drugs. So those are some of the dangers that kids can get exposed to when they are out of school. Another very important role of the school is integration in the host community. So imagine if you have a lot of children that end up that flee a country that is in war and they go to another country. Of course, they face a lot of difficulties adapting to that new country. Maybe they don't speak the language. Maybe there's a big cultural difference. Maybe they live in a difficult circumstance as well, and obviously they need to learn a lot to be able to adapt to that new community. So imagine if an Arabic-speaking Syrian child is fleeing to my country, to Belgium. This child would need to learn Dutch language or French language, because we have two languages in Belgium, of course. But we'll also have to try and eventually live in Belgium as a normal citizen. So that means that you have a better chance, of course, of getting a good job and getting a good livelihood when you have a diploma. When you first go to primary school, if you're young, then go to a secondary school, and then maybe even have the opportunity to go to a graduate school or to a university or to a technical school. So you can see that it is very important for integration into a host community. Talked about this as well. Sustainable future is very important. We all know that we live now globally in a world in which information and knowledge has become much more important, and this is often awarded with diplomas. So anybody that has a chance to get a good education will have a better chance to make a sustainable living in the future. What are we going to do today? I will try and explain to you in about 45 minutes a few basic concepts on refugees, asylum and migration, and also on statelessness. So you as a teacher understand a little bit better what we're talking about. Of course, teachers have to learn themselves a lot. So one of the objectives of today is that I hope to learn or to teach you at least a little bit on the basic concept of this subject, refugees, asylum and migration. I will try and provide some guidance for primary and secondary school teachers among you on including refugee children in the classroom as well. These are very simple, a few very simple guidelines that I can give you. We will also discuss where refugees come from, where they go, what motivates them to leave their country and find safety elsewhere. And then lastly, we'll discuss a few challenges that you may face as a teacher or as an educator in your setting in working with refugee children. What is our philosophy here? So step number one is always learn first about refugees before you teach about refugees. So that's a little bit of the objective. What we're going to try today is to really deconstruct that whole complex subject for you so you can understand it step by step. And you will see that it will make it much easier to also read some of the information that's out there on refugees, asylum and migration. The objective here is that you would get the knowledge to be able to teach this subject a little bit better in the classroom as well. A second objective, the second part of our philosophy is with this knowledge, if you've learned how to teach about refugees, if you know what refugees are, who refugees are, where they come from, where they go, you have built some knowledge that will allow you to teach refugees and their host communities in a better way. So imagine that you are in Germany, and if you have a class with some refugee children from Afghan origin or from Syrian origin, it would of course massively help if you know what the status of these children is, whether or not they are still in an asylum procedure, for example, whether or not they have refugee status and can actually stay in Germany, and then also where they come from, what motivated them to flee and things like that. And that will, we hope then that will facilitate your work in the classroom. So, a few steps today. First, we'll go into basic terminology. We'll go into facts and figures. I'll give you a few tips and tricks on how to teach in an age-appropriate manner about refugees. Then we'll talk a little bit about humanization and storyfying, using stories actually to teach about refugees. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges that you may face when you have refugees in your classroom and some of the things that you can do to remedy these challenges. So first, basic terminology. We'll teach the basics and we'll start from the beginning. That's very simple. For those of you that are in classrooms every day, and I think most of you are, you will know that children are very curious. You will know that the younger they are, the most curious they are actually. I happen to be a very young father as well, and I happen to get the first questions from my little daughter as well. And some of the questions posed by children are often the most tough to answer. So I always say that children are one of the best askers of questions in the world. When we talk about refugees, let me share with you a number of questions that I had when I was working with teachers in classrooms, in primary and secondary, in all different grades. An obvious question that some of the children have asked us is, why do refugees come here? Or what do they eat? One remark I had as well is, my mother says they get a lot of money. Another child asked us once, what kind of toys do they have in Syria? Some other questions can be a bit more serious. For example, a remark that we had once in which a boy said, well, my brother says that all refugees are terrorists. Other pertinent questions is like, can they take their mom and dad when they come here? Can refugee children actually take their mothers from South Sudan or from Myanmar when they flee to another country? And another thing that's very linked to the digital age, we've heard fairly young children say at some point, well, I read on Facebook that refugees could have a disease. So you can see that there is a very wide range of almost innocent, curious questions about refugees, but there are also some serious questions about refugees. And we think actually that deconstructing this whole complex subject into simple terms will actually answer a lot of those questions. Have a look at this. So you can see how complex this subject is and how easy it is to actually not use the right words and to make mistakes in terminology. The Geneva Convention, I talked about this. We have refugees, but we also have migrants. We have asylum seekers, internally displaced persons. Whoever heard of those? We have stateless people. Are these all the same? No, they're not. And you can see already that there is a big risk here that we mix up all the subjects. So I'm going to try and run you through a very simple method to explain all these terms. And normally I do this in a face-to-face setting where I ask people the following question. Who is a refugee? And then you point to somebody in your classroom and you ask them, well, you can explain to me in 3 very simple sentences. You cannot have 4 sentences, you cannot have 2, you can only have 3. And you have to name me the 3 most important things that makes a refugee a refugee. So, obviously we cannot interact too much today, so I will give you the answers like this. And you can see it actually in a video that I will include in the presentation as well. This is the link, but Alex will distribute this later. So if we now go to the answer, we can actually explain who is a refugee, the answer to that question in 3 simple questions. Number 1 is a very simple fact. A refugee is not in his or her country. So a very important thing to remember about refugees is that per definition they are outside of their country. So a Syrian person that needs to flee because of the war can find himself or herself in Turkey, in Germany, in the United States, in South Sudan, in other countries. A refugee is never in his or her own country. That's a very important thing to remember. The second very important thing to remember is that a refugee is somebody fleeing danger. What do we mean by danger? Danger could be war. Danger could also be persecution. Just a word on persecution. What does persecution mean? Persecution could mean that in your country you are in danger because of your race, because of your religion, because of your sexual orientation, because of some opinions that you have voiced. For example, you might be locked up because you are of a certain political conviction. You might be subject to torture, to because you are part of a certain ethnic group, things like that. So this really puts you at risk, this puts you in danger, and that could be a reason for you to want to leave your country. So that's what we mean by persecution. The third important thing to know about a refugee is that a refugee is always at risk if she or he returns to their country. So there is no way back. That's the simplest way you can say it. Now, if you memorize or if you internalize these three, or if you teach these three simple concepts, then you capture actually the exact essence of who is a refugee. Number one, they're not in her or his country. Two, a refugee is somebody fleeing danger. Could be a war, could be persecution. Number three, a refugee is at risk and cannot go back. That's an easier way I can say it. This is from one of our videos, and this is how we express one of the important principles of the Geneva Convention. Remember, I talked about the Geneva Convention in the beginning, is we have internationally agreed that people who are outside of their country, people who are in danger, and people who cannot return to their own countries, because they would be in danger, they cannot be sent back. So this is the guiding principle that we have about refugees in the world. So you can see this in a still from one of our explainer animation videos. The principle is called, with the legal term, non-refoulement. We do not send people back to danger. Now, of course, who is a migrant? Migrant is a different term. And again, we can explain this in three very simple facts, if you will. The first fact is actually very similar to what we've seen with refugees. So a migrant is a person who is not in her or his country. So a migrant is by definition somebody that's left his or her country. This could be me going to work in another country, for example. Or actually a better example is my wife. She is British and she is living in Belgium with us. And of course she works here and she moved to Belgium for work reasons. So that is a migrant, that is somebody that is in another country. Second important thing is, and that is the fundamental difference with a refugee, is that a migrant moves for other reasons than war or persecution. There is no immediate danger. So why do migrants move? Migrants move because they want to find a job in another country. Migrants may move because they want to study in another country. So you have a lot of students that go to other countries and then end up staying there. Love is a very important motivation to migrate. You have people that want to rejoin their loved ones in other countries, so that is very well possible. And there's a myriad of other reasons actually why people could migrate to other countries, because they want a better quality of living. Maybe they want to have access to certain education. Maybe they want to have access to certain research facilities if they are scientists or something like that. But the third point here is very important, is that a migrant could in principle return without immediate danger. And that is also the fundamental difference with a refugee. So the first, just to recapitulate this, the first thing we need to remember about migrants is exactly the same as refugees. Per definition, these are persons that are outside of their country. The reasons why migrants move are completely different. Migrant moves for reasons other than war or persecution. And the third principle also is that a migrant could in principle return without immediate danger. And this is again a link to an explainer animation film that you can watch after the seminar. An IDP. Now we're getting into maybe more difficult territory, or into a more complex term. First of all, IDP, what is that acronym? An IDP is an internally displaced person. IDP, internally displaced person. That is a very long term and a very legal term, but I will try to explain it in 5 simple terms here. The first is that there is one fundamental difference between internally displaced persons, and refugees and migrants. Internally displaced persons are still inside their own country. So that would be me living in Brussels, in Belgium, and then, for example, going to another city in Belgium, going to Ghent, where I studied, for example. But that doesn't necessarily make me an internally displaced person. The second point is exactly the same point as we've seen in refugees. So an IDP is also somebody fleeing danger. Somebody is forced to leave their house because of war or persecution. So the bombs may be falling, or the police may be looking for you because you have a certain political opinion, or because of your sexual orientation. So there is a factor of danger there. So point one and point one is completely different as what we've seen with migrants and refugees. Point two is exactly the same as refugees. Internally displaced persons are people fleeing danger. The third element here is also exactly the same as refugees. That danger does not go away if the person returns. If, for example, I was living here in Brussels, in Belgium, and there would be a war here and the bombs would be falling, I would be forced to leave my house. If I go 10 kilometers further to another city in Belgium and I've escaped the danger, I could not go back to Brussels because the bombs are still falling. So that factor of danger is still there. Now, the simplest way to explain this is, imagine if you are in your own country, and I hope your country is not at war, but if your country is at war, is that imagine that you live in the capital city of this country, and imagine that this country where you live has a coastline, and you have an old aunt or an old uncle living in a little apartment at the seaside. And imagine that a war would break out in your city, and the capital city would be under siege, maybe like Sarajevo in the Yugoslavian wars in the 1990s. And you would basically need to leave your house because the bombs are falling on it, and you are looking for places to go. And you managed to escape the war zone, and you managed to get to a safer place, and actually you managed to get to your aunt or your uncle living at the seaside in that same country. Well, then you are an internally displaced person. You are somebody that's running away from danger and is running away from war, but you've never crossed an international border. So that makes you an internally displaced person. Now, a very important thing to realize is that we talk a lot about refugees, we talk a lot about migrants. And if you read the newspapers and if you look at the TV news and if you look on the internet, you will find the terms refugees and migrants a lot. But it's very important to know that internally displaced persons are actually the largest group in the world that are affected by danger, are affected by war and persecution in the world, because there are twice as many internally displaced persons as refugees. So this means that most of the people, the largest group of people that are affected by war and persecution, that need to run away from their homes because the bombs are falling or because security services coming to look for them for some reason. The largest group is actually still inside their own country. And there are twice as many as IDPs as refugees. A fifth thing that we like to add to this mix to explain to you is that getting help to IDPs is often very difficult. Now let me give you the example again of you having fled the capital city of your country and you go to live at the seaside with your aunt or uncle. Let's now assume that part of your country has been completely locked down because there are armies fighting each other and it is impossible to go there. And let's now assume that behind this fighting line there is another country that wants to send help in. That is totally impossible because the coastal area where you and your aunt live is not to be reached. You're effectively blocked out from the outside world. And that is the case in for a lot of internally displaced persons. They find themselves in areas that are completely shut off from the outside world, and it is therefore very, very difficult to get help to these persons. So if we, as a UNHCR, for example, wanted to move in and bring tents and bring food and water and other essential things to internally displaced persons, it is often not possible for us because warring parties or governments won't let us through. So it is very difficult to get help to internally displaced persons. And again, you can see an explanatory video there, which I invite you to watch. So let's now have this sink in a little bit before we go to another term that is much used, and that is asylum seeker. Now, who is an asylum seeker? Again, as with migrants and with refugees, an asylum seeker is someone who is in another country. So per definition, people that we consider to be asylum seekers are in another country. So that's quite the same as refugees. It's the same as migrants. It's not the same as internally displaced persons, of course. Asylum seekers claim to be in danger. So they are saying, they arrive in another country and they say, well, I'm in danger, in my country there's war, or I'm being persecuted for one reason or another, and I cannot go back. So that's what asylum seekers say. So basically, and then a third thing that's important is, remember, there is this international convention in which we say that if indeed a person is in danger, we're not going to send him or her back to their own country. Now, any person can come into a country and say, well, I'm in danger, I cannot go back to my country. So if somebody comes into a country and says, well, I'm in danger and I'm an asylum seeker and blah, 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 you need to prove that this is the case. So the third important thing to know about asylum seekers is that they still need to prove whether or not they are in danger and cannot go back to their country, and hence are refugees. If indeed during an asylum procedure an asylum seeker can prove that he or she is 1. outside of his or her country, 2. in danger because of war or persecution, 3. would be in danger if they would go back. If that can be proven, those 3 things, that corresponds to our definition of refugee. If those 3 things can be proven, an asylum seeker can get what we call protected. And remember what I said about the UNHCR logo with the 2 hands. We will make sure that this person is safe in another country. So we will put those 2 hands around that person and we will protect him. Now, what does that word protected mean in the case of somebody fleeing danger and going to another country? This means that this person will have a right to stay in that other country as long as the situation in their own country is not improving. If your claim is credible and well-founded, then you will have that right to stay, and you will have actually the right to be treated as any other legal resident in that country. That means that you will have the right to work. That means that you will be able to send your children to education, to schools. That means that you can study there if you want. That means that you can buy a house or rent a house if you want. That means that you can have access to health services, and that means that you can actually basically have more or less the same rights as any other legal resident. So for example, if somebody flees from Syria and goes to France, let's say, and if somebody arrives in that country, in France, from Syria, the first thing that person will need to do is to go to the local asylum office and say, hello, knock on the door and say, hello, I'm in danger, I'm in danger. I cannot go back to my country. Can I prove this? And then the asylum office will say, okay, that's good. Mister, you are coming from Syria. Okay, but you will have to prove this. So this person coming from Syria to France will then have to prove with documents or through interviews. And there's a whole process of verification going on then, and it can take many months. And then after those few months, it is decided that the claim of this person is credible. So we have decided that indeed you come from Syria, so you are from another country. Second thing is, indeed, you come from a war zone, so you were in danger. So that is the second part of the definition of refugee. And thirdly, we know the situation in Syria and you cannot go back at the moment, so we recognize you as a refugee in France. That's what happens. At that moment, when France decides that you, as a Syrian person coming there, as an asylum seeker, decides that you correspond to the definition of refugee, then you have the right to stay in France. So that's sort of the dynamic between refugee and asylum seeker. Obviously, as Alex said in the beginning, if there are any questions, we'll happy to follow up. So I hope this has sort of cut through the complexity a little bit of these 4 basic terms that we need to know. Just to recap, we have talked about refugee, we've talked about asylum seekers, we've talked about internally displaced persons, and we've talked about migrants. This brings us to step 2. So now we know the 4 basic categories of people that are affected by being war and persecution in the world. So we'll talk a little bit about facts and figures. Remember the questions of the children in the beginning of the presentation, where we said, well, where do these people come from and where do they go to? Why do they flee? And you know, where can we find all these refugees, and are they all coming to our country? I will share with you a few very simple facts and figures about refugees. These are all based on all the facts and figures that UNHCR has. Why do we have all these facts and figures, and why are these facts and figures so reliable and accurate? That is simply because UNHCR is the United Nations agency that registers all these refugees worldwide, or registers them in cooperation with governments. So we are sitting on all the data on refugees in the world. And so I'm just going to make some advertising for my own organization here, but if you need the latest and reliable figures on refugees in the world, then UNHCR has them for you. Let's have a little bit of a look at this. You can see here a lot of facts and figures, and I'm not going to sort of throw them all at you. We'll just discuss a few, and we'll grab back to the definitions that we've seen in the beginning. And I hope you can see my pointer here a little bit, but I will talk you through this. So first of all, we are living actually in a very extraordinary time, because at this moment in time, we are seeing the highest number of people forced to flee because of war, because of persecution in the world, since the Second World War. So we've reached the highest level. There are now 70.8 million people in the world that are what we call forcibly displaced. They had to leave their homes because of war, because of persecution. They were literally in danger and they had to run away from their house. 70.8 million people. And just to give you a little illustration of that, that is more than the population of a country like France, or the UK, or Italy. It is less than the population of Germany. It is probably the population of a number of countries in Europe combined. Now look at the second bar here. You can see the blue figure of 41.3 million. You can see the green figure of 25.9 million. And you can see the black figure of 3.5 million. Let's look at the first one. The 41.3 million is the number of internally displaced people. Remember, we talked about internally displaced people. These are people that are still stuck inside their own country. They were forced to flee their own house because of war or persecution, but they are still in their own country. Maybe they live with their aunt and uncle at the seaside, but they are in a dire situation and they are internally displaced. 41.3 million in the world. Then you can see that there are 25.9 million refugees in the world. So these are the people that have fled their homes because of war or persecution, but made it to another country. Remember what I told you in the beginning is that the figure of refugees, or the figure of internally displaced people, is much larger, almost double. Well, give or take. Let's be generous here. Almost double the number of refugees. So you can see that most of the people that are actually affected by wars are still inside their countries. So how many people are currently in other countries and they claim to be in danger and they want to stay in another country to be safe because they have to flee their own country because of war or persecution? These are the asylum seekers, as we talked about. There are currently about 3.5 million of them worldwide. So if you take those together, then you arrive at a figure of 70.8 million. Sometimes at UNHCR we call this a nation of displaced people, a nation of people that had to leave their homes. Now, just another few facts and figures that I can share with you here as well is where are these people? That is a very important thing to know. And I will point you to the figure here with the globe. Around 8 out of 10 of these people that are displaced by war or persecution are in countries neighboring the countries of origin. So if you look at the countries that are affected by war at the moment, for example Syria, for example Iraq, for example South Sudan, for example Myanmar, for example Central African Republic, if you look at those countries, where are most refugees from those countries? They are in the countries surrounding these countries. So in the case of Syria and Iraq, you will find refugees from those two countries in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Turkey, as well as in countries that may be one country down. So you can find quite a lot of refugees in Egypt as well, for example. So that is important to know. Why are people staying so close to their own country? Of course, because first of all, many people that flee their own country hope that the situation will return to normal soon, and they want to return as soon as possible, and that's why they don't travel that far. Secondly, not all the people that have to flee their own country can go to countries far away. They just have to cross the border and get to safety, and that's why they end up in neighboring countries. I'm going to skip to the next thing now. Now, what does that mean, 70.8 million? We have a teaching sheet here, and this is a little bit of teaching that I can that you can do with secondary school students in your classrooms. Is 70.8 million. That means that approximately 25 persons per minute have to leave their house because of war or persecution. So look at this for a little bit. In 2018 alone, an estimated 13.6 million people had to leave their homes. These are the people that left their homes only in that year. So we have 70.8 million in total, but in 2018 there were 13.6 million new refugees, so to speak. New refugees, new IDPs. So that amounts to 25 people per minute. Now, you can do a very simple game with your class, and you can basically first teach the basics. Who's a refugee, who's a migrant, who is an IDP, and then you can actually ask very simply, if your class is rather large, for 25 people to leave your classroom and to see how many people would be left. If you do this with a larger group, for example, you can ask 25 people per minute to leave the group, and then you will see what the effect of this is. This just shows how enormous the scale of this problem is. You can find the teaching resources here, and we'll make sure to include the link as well. So all these teaching sheets that I'm showing you today, which you can use, of course, in your teaching practice, you can find them on the Teaching About Refugees website. Another way of expressing this is that for those of you from the United Kingdom that are liking Premier League football, 70.8 million people corresponds to 90 times the typical Premier League football stadium. So if you would have to put all the displaced people in the world into football stadiums, you would need 90 of them. But anyway, these are so you can find also an animation film, which is this link, which explains where refugees where they come from, how many there are in the world, and where they go. Now, where do refugees come from? Remember our question there. So it will be no surprise that in 2018, so 2 years ago, when we had the most recent figures, most refugees came, unfortunately, from the Syrian Arab Republic, from Syria. There were about 6.7 million at that point, and unfortunately that figure has grown in the meantime as well, so we expect to see more. The second country of origin in the world is Afghanistan, where we see that 2.7 million people have left the countries and have become refugees. South Sudan is number 3 in that ranking with 2.3 million. Then we see Myanmar, a country in Southeast Asia, where 1.1 million people have left the country, and then Somalia closes the top 5. I would just point out that a relatively new situation that we have in South America is Venezuela, where because of the situation in that country, a lot of people have fled as well. There are about 3.4 million outside of the country, 3.4 million Venezuelans. So you can see the scale of some of the refugee flows out of these countries are quite large. And again, we have an animation film that explains this to you. Now, where do refugees go? And that is a very important question always. As I told you in the beginning of this segment, 80% of the people that flee their countries and have become refugees are actually in neighboring countries. And you can see that to a certain extent reflected here. So, at this moment, Turkey is the country in the world where the most refugees are hosted. There are about 3.7 million refugees in Turkey. In Pakistan is number 2 with 1.4 million refugees. These refugees are mostly from Afghanistan, by the way. In Turkey, obviously, you will find a lot of refugees from Syria because it is a neighboring country. Pakistan is a neighboring country of Afghanistan. Uganda is a neighboring country of South Sudan. Central African Republic is also very near, so you will find a lot of refugees in Uganda and in Sudan, who are both countries that border on that country. There's only one European country in that top ranking, which is Germany, which has about 1.1 million refugees at the moment. And they come from all manner of countries. Now imagine how this could affect a country. Let's talk about Lebanon. Lebanon is a country of about 4.4 million people. And proportionate to its population, there are well over 1 million Syrian refugees there. So imagine that about 1 in 6 people in your country, or even more, 1 in 4 people in your country is a refugee. Imagine that in Belgium, my country, that all of a sudden 2.5 million people from the Netherlands would come to Belgium because there is a war in the Netherlands. That is sort of the proportion we're talking about. So you can see that some of these influxes of refugees can be very, very large. Now, if you look at this sheet again, the countries where they come from and the countries where they go to, we've created very simple teaching sheets that you can use in secondary education from the age of 12, where you can basically do the exercise and ask your pupils to guess which countries refugees come from and to guess which countries they go to. And you just do a little class activity in which you actually take the map and say, well, okay guys, now you write down to me, where do most refugees go to? What are the countries they go to? And then you can take this as an example.
Sorry,
Now,
just
if we teach about
reminder,
refugees, asylum, and migration,
just a reminder that it's 4:53. So if you can present for clock, 5 more minutes, and then we will have time for questions and answers. Thank you.
That was the objective here, yeah. That's exactly what the timing that I had in mind here, Alex. So I shall conclude shortly. Okay, now the main thing I've just explained in the segments already. So if you want to teach about this subject, especially in secondary education, you can use all of the techniques that I just taught you, which is to break every concept down into simple concepts. You can talk about facts and figures on refugees, and you can all find this on the UNHCR website, for example, but you can also find it, of course, in other resources. Now, one thing that I want to point out here as well is, for those of you that teach in primary education or to younger children, is watch out with the materials that you use. Very shortly, I will share with you an experience that I had, which I call my biggest failure as a teacher, which was that a few years ago, when I was far less experienced than I am now, I was asked to by a primary school teacher to present and to explain to 8-year-olds who a refugee is. And I was like, but this is way too complex. I cannot explain this to these children. But the teacher that I was working with, she told me, well, it's very simple, Frederick. You just show a picture of a famous refugee and they will understand immediately what you're talking about. So I showed the picture of Einstein. Now, of course, I then discovered, because the minute I put up a picture in front of the classroom, these 8-year-olds were scratching their head, and I asked them, do you know who this person is? And there was one boy that said, well, I think it's a professor of some sort or something like that. I very quickly discovered that, talking about the inventor of special relativity was way too complex for 8-year-olds. And my whole lesson was a complete failure. So what I want to express with this example is that watch out for complexity. You've seen in the beginning that you can very, very easily confound terminology and things like that. So make sure that you adapt your lessons to the age of your students. It's very easy to go into way too complex. Especially for the younger age groups, we have a curriculum on our website that is specifically for primary education that is much simpler. It will explain, okay, some kids come from countries where there may be a war, but we are not going into all these details of what the exact differences are and things like that. We try to teach the basics nevertheless. The second thing you need to be careful with, especially with the younger age groups, of course, is the imagery you show. And this is a very tragic image from 2 children that were rescued from a bombing in Syria. And of course, these are images that are very effective to bring across, the plight of refugees. But this is, of course, something you cannot use for the younger children because, first of all, you risk stressing or even traumatizing them. And this takes away from learning. So they will only remember the image and they will actually learn nothing. So one tip that I would give you is to be careful with imagery like that. Another tip that I can give you here is to humanize and storify. So this is, for example, an outtake of a video of, they are all available on our website as well, of a video of a 7-year-old girl, a Syrian girl, that tells her story about how she came from Syria. And this is material that we use for primary education, for example. What is my main advice here? My main advice here is that if you know of stories of refugee children that are the same age as your pupils in your classroom, if you have refugee children in your classroom that are willing to share their story, please use that because it brings home the experience and it makes it much more human. I can show you all the figures you want in the world and I can show you all the maps, but of course nothing is as effective as just showing a story. And then the last step maybe is learn how to teach with refugees in your classroom. Now, I know that a lot of you may already have refugees in your classroom and you know that there are certain challenges that we have there. Because refugees have gone through a whole experience of fleeing, they might have experienced war, trauma in their own country, they might have experienced a very difficult journey taking boats through the Mediterranean, and then coming to a country where they have to live in an asylum center. So these are very difficult experiences, and the first thing that you may experience is that some of your kids may have, some of your refugee kids in your classroom may have behavioral challenges that have to do with stress and trauma. I would just advise you to read through this stress and trauma guidebook that we have. Very important piece of advice here is teachers are no therapists. Don't try to diagnose the children in your classroom. We always say to teachers that have refugees in their classroom, if there are behavioral issues, please do use, if it is available, of course, but please do use the protocol of your school in this case and go to school psychologist or to social services if needed. That is a very important piece of advice. This is a list of the behavioral challenges that you may find in stressed or traumatized children. You can read this for yourself, but this is basically a all-in stress and trauma guide. So if you're interested in this matter, I would really advise you to look at that. There's a lot of literature out there that may be very useful as well. We also have a small language learning guide. Just one very short thing on that is a lot of you will have refugee children in their classroom that have difficulty learning because of language. This guidebook explains that it is actually quite normal for these kids to have language difficulties, and it is not because they speak the language already very well, that they actually understand the subjects that you are teaching very well. And there are a few techniques in there for you to consider to work with refugee children. to make sure that they understand what you're teaching them as well, and also to have a realistic time scale for these students to catch up with the learning in your school. So that was all for me, Alex. I have added here the URL, the link to our Teaching About Refugees website. These are being translated into several languages, and maybe we could include some of those language versions as well. I think in most European languages they are available. Also in Fusha, in standard classic Arabic, the website is available. So for the Arabic speakers among you, they will be able to download these materials as well. These are all free teaching materials. They are under a Creative Commons license, so that means that as long as you mention that they come from UNHCR, you can use them freely in your lesson preparations. And I think we can open for questions. Alex, I hope I was within time. Yes, it is 5 o'clock sharp.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Actually, yes, there was a question. There was actually some questions about the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker, and some learners, some eTwinners here were commenting and trying to explain.
Yes.
But I would rather ask in terms of education, of educational materials, in terms of the materials you shared with us, is it also relevant for asylum seekers? How can we address asylum seekers in our classroom? What is the difference between both?
Yeah, so you have to be your question pertains to what is the difference in teaching asylum seekers and in teaching refugees in a classroom, right? So the situation of refugees and refugee children and asylum children in your classroom will be very different, and there's one fundamental difference there. Refugees are reasonably sure, once they are recognized, that they can stay for the longer term in the country. So if you have a Syrian in Germany that is recognized as a refugee, and you have a 12-year-old child there, you can assume that this child will be in your classroom for quite a while, or in your school at least, and that they will have a normal school career. Whereas asylum seekers, or children of asylum seekers, are still uncertain whether or not they can stay in the country. So you might well see a situation in which you have an asylum seeker from a certain country in your classroom, and they are living in an asylum center, and after a few months their request to be recognized as refugees is refused. What happens with these people? They are usually asked to leave the country, and they do not longer have the right to send their kids to that school. So unfortunately, you then see those people disappear. Now, of course, you can imagine what kind of stress and what kind of psychological stress this causes with specifically asylum-seeking children. So that is the fundamental difference. Their situation is completely different. And of course, as a teacher, you have to be sensible to that. You have to know this. Of course, you can build up your expectation there. You can see that if there are any stresses or any behavioral problems with a child that is in an asylum seeker situation, then you know that this is what is behind there. What I always advise is try and engage with the children, and especially with the parents, as much as possible. Make sure that you show that you're open to these children and to their problems to a certain extent. It helps a lot to show specifically asylum seekers that you know about their situation, and that you know what their anxieties may be about. I hope that addresses some of the question.
Yes, thank you very much. I think that was very clearly explained. Thank you very much for this excellent session. Please, participants, if you have any questions, type them in the chat now. This is your time to ask any additional questions. And while you do that, I will explain that in several, let's say, several.
And I will try and follow you.
We will have the recording available, and also a file with all the links and the presentation available on the TwinSpace. So you would be able also to take a look at the presentation and access all the links. So don't worry for that. Any other thing you would like to add, Frederick? Because I see that we don't have questions.
Okay. Well, as we said before the seminar, I think, Alex, what we could try and do is if we gather the questions from the chat, then I can try and make a sort of an FAQ or try and respond to some of the most common questions, and then we could share them later with the participants.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Frederick. Thank you for sharing
So
this
that might be
valuable
a useful thing.
information with
Other than
us.
that,
Yes, sorry.
and also, Alex, if I may interrupt one last time, is you can see actually that I've put my email address there, which is a big risk because you're a very big group, all of you, and you're from very different countries, and you're going to now completely and utterly bombard me with emails, of course. If you do have pertinent questions, please do not hesitate to call to use that email address and to write me an email, because I do like having direct contact with people that are practitioners in their field. So please do not hesitate to do that. The only thing I will say to all participants is it might take a while for me to reply. So if I don't respond immediately, please accept my apology beforehand. What I usually do with groups of trainees is then when I give my email addresses, then after a while I try and group the questions into several clusters, and I try to reply to everybody, and then try to reply to a cluster of questions at least. I know that it is a bit of might create a bit of a logistical nightmare for myself, but nevertheless, I would share my contact details here so people can contact me.
Thank you very much, and thank you all of you for your enthusiasm to learn.
So, and that's all, and I think.
And with that, yes, if you have any final words, there is a question if there is a project about refugees of some of our eTwinners, if they can send you the project. Well, my question will be to these eTwinners, what would you like to share? You would like to share a good practice or an example of practice? And if you do that, and then the question is for you, Frederick, would that be interesting for you to see examples of projects with refugee pupils? Or are you interested more in concrete questions about content and how to address refugees?
Absolutely. So
in the class?
In both. So if you have a good practice in teaching mathematics to Syrian refugees in Serbia or in Denmark, please do send them to me, because that's always useful for us to learn. What you need to know is that UNHCR, well, we are not an education agency, but we do have quite a bit of education capacity. And we like to learn from people that really work in the field, so people that really work in education. That is also the reason why I try to visit at least a few schools a year, if not every month. So as you told everybody in the intro, Alex, I am a failed teacher in the sense that I never certified as a teacher, but I do have a basis in pedagogy and stuff like that. And that's why for this particular project, I hold it for very important that I, first of all, get as much information from teachers as I can about teaching practice and about good teaching practices. So yes, if you have good practices, please share them with me. Secondly, also, all the information that comes from the practicalities of working with refugee children or teaching the subject in your classroom, even if you don't have refugees in your classroom, that's all very useful for me. So very open to all that.
Thank you very much, and thank you all of you for participating. Have a nice afternoon, and we hope to see you in future online seminars. And especially thank you, Frederick, for this very interesting and inspiring lesson. Thank you.